She always believed Christmas was about perfection. The glitter, the lights, the flawless photographs that captured everything except the truth. That December, Julia Miller thought she had it all figured out. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the streets of Willow Creek were already glowing. Storefronts shimmered in gold, carols floated from every corner, and high school halls buzzed with excitement for the upcoming Christmas party. Julia stood at the center of it all, stylish, confident, admired. The kind of girl whose laughter turned heads and whose approval meant everything in a world ruled by popularity. But beneath the smooth curls and perfect smile, there was a tension she couldn't quite name. Something fragile in the way her mother looked at her lately, or in the quiet pauses at the dinner table when her father checked his phone and said nothing. Still, Julia refused to let anything ruin her favorite time of year. That morning, she arrived at school wearing the red sweater her mother had knitted. The yarn was thick and uneven, with little imperfections that screamed homemade. Julia tugged at the collar, uncomfortable under the fluorescent hallway lights. "Where did you get that?" Madison Blake asked, raising a manicured brow. Her perfume smelled like winter roses and superiority. "My mom made it," Julia said, forcing a small laugh. Madison giggled, tilting her head. "Next time, tell her you're allergic to wool. Homemade sweaters are like elephants, nice to look at, but no one actually wears them." Their group of friends erupted in laughter. Julia smiled too, pretending it didn't sting. Later, at lunch, Madison leaned closer, flipping her glossy hair. "So, about the Christmas party. I want it to be perfect this year. And I'm serious. Perfect. Jason Reed's family just moved here, and I already invited him." Julia rolled her eyes. "You mean the guy who works after school? With the construction company?" "Exactly. He's cute in a small town kind of way," Madison said with a smirk. "Invite him too, okay? Let's make sure this party trends." Julia agreed, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere, toward her mother, who had looked so pale that morning, and the way her father's tone had changed lately, calm but heavy. That evening, the Miller house glowed with warm lights and the smell of cinnamon. Laura Miller was sitting on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, knitting something new. Her hair looked thinner than before, but her smile was the same, gentle and full of love. Julia leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't have to make that, Mom. You should be resting." Laura looked up. "Knitting helps me rest, sweetheart. Besides, Christmas is coming. I'm making stockings for you and David." Her younger brother, David, was sprawled on the floor with a pile of toy cars. He looked up, grinning. "Can mine be blue this time? Like a race car?" Laura laughed softly. "Blue it is." From the kitchen, Jordan Miller's voice cut through the warm moment. "Dinner's ready." The table looked festive, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and the smell of rosemary filling the air. Julia took her seat, noticing how her mother picked at her food, barely eating. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm fine, honey," Laura replied, smiling too quickly. "Just tired." "It's been a long day." Her father glanced at her mother, then back at Julia. "You have that Christmas party coming up, right?" "Yeah," Julia said. "We're still planning everything. Don't forget your curfew," Jordan added, his voice half stern, half distracted. "Home by 8. 8, Dad. Come on. The party doesn't even start until 7. 8, he repeated. "Your mother and I have plans that evening." Something about his tone silenced her protest. Laura reached for her daughter's hand across the table, her palm cool and soft. "He's right, honey. Let's just have a quiet night that day, okay?" Julia nodded reluctantly, pretending not to notice the tremor in her mother's hand. After dinner, she retreated to her room, pulling out her phone. Madison had sent a string of texts, outfit ideas, decorations, gossip. Julia scrolled through them absent-mindedly, her reflection glowing on the screen. Behind her, a faint hum filled the house, her mother humming a Christmas tune. the same one she'd sung every December since Julia could remember. For the first time, Julia noticed how fragile that voice sounded. The next morning, she awoke to the smell of coffee and the sight of her father standing by the front door, dressed in his usual gray suit. He kissed Laura's forehead before leaving for work. Julia watched from the stairs, the quiet, the glances, the unspoken things. Something inside her chest tightened. "Julia," Laura called gently, breaking the silence. "Would you come with me later today? I need to stop by the hospital." "The hospital? Why?" "Just a checkup," she said. "It's nothing to worry about." But Julia did worry. She didn't say it out loud, but the word hospital echoed in her mind all day, through class, through lunch, through the endless chatter about parties and gifts. That evening, the first snow began to fall, soft, quiet, almost hesitant. Julia stood by her window, watching it coat the streets in white. Somewhere in the distance, Christmas music played, cheerful and hollow at the same time. Her mother's red sweater lay folded neatly on the chair beside her bed. Julia reached out and touched the yarn, running her fingers over the uneven stitches. For the first time, she didn't see imperfection. She saw love. She saw time. She saw something she hadn't noticed before, fragility disguised as warmth. And though she didn't know it yet, that sweater would become the thread that held her heart together when everything else began to fall apart. The next morning began like any other. The smell of toasted bread drifted from the kitchen. The faint jingle of a Christmas playlist filled the air, and the Miller house seemed wrapped in normalcy, the kind that hides cracks too small for anyone to notice. Julia came downstairs, brushing snowflakes off her coat. Her father was at the table, half buried in legal documents, his tie loosened, coffee untouched. Her mother stood by the stove, moving slowly, stirring a pot of oatmeal, as though every motion took thought. "Morning," Julia said, forcing a brightness she didn't feel. "Morning, sweetheart," Laura replied with a tired smile. "You're up early. I have a project to finish before class," Julia said. "Are you okay?" Laura hesitated, glancing at Jordan, then back to her daughter. "I'm fine, honey. Just didn't sleep well." David appeared in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Mom," my stomach's growling louder than our vacuum. That made everyone laugh for a moment. A small bubble of warmth in the cool morning. Then Jordan's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, voice low, the call ending as abruptly as it began. He looked at Laura. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Julia caught something in that glance, something that didn't belong to ordinary mornings. By afternoon, she was at school pretending everything was normal. But when the final bell rang, instead of heading to Madison's to discuss party decorations, she found herself walking home. Her boots left thin tracks on the sidewalk, the December air biting at her cheeks. The house was quiet when she opened the door. Too quiet. Her mother's knitting lay folded on the couch. The TV was off, the clock ticking louder than usual. Mom, no answer. She found her father in the living room, pacing, one hand over his mouth, his tie now loosened completely. "Dad, what's going on?" He stopped walking, his eyes were red. "Sit down, Julia." Her stomach tightened. "Why? What happened?" "Your mother's at the hospital," he said quietly. "She's been going there for treatments for a few months now. Chemotherapy." The word fell heavy between them, like a weight pressing all the air from the room. Julia blinked, shaking her head. "What? No, that's not possible." She said it was just a checkup. She didn't want you to worry. I don't understand," Julia whispered. "She looked fine." "She tried to," Jordan said. "She wanted to keep things normal for you and David, but the truth is, she's been fighting cancer." The world seemed to tilt. Julia felt the floor give way under her feet, her mind scrambling for something to hold on to. Is she going to die?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "We don't know. The doctors are hopeful, but there's still a long road ahead. She's having surgery tomorrow." Julia stood up, her heart pounding. "And you didn't tell me? You both kept this from me." Her voice broke. Jordan sighed, his own voice rough. We wanted one last normal Christmas before everything changed. Tears burned Julia's eyes. You should have told me. I could have helped. Her father's expression softened. You can help now, but Julia didn't want to hear that. She stormed upstairs, slammed the door, and threw herself onto her bed. Outside, snow kept falling, soft, endless, and uncaring. Hours later, she heard a quiet knock on her door. Jules? It was David's voice. Go away. He opened the door anyway, clutching his stuffed penguin, the one he'd had since he was little. Dad said Mom's sick. Is she gonna be okay? Julia swallowed hard. Yeah, she whispered. She's gonna be fine. Promise. Promise. But when he left, closing the door behind him, Julia pressed her face into the pillow and let the tears come. The next morning, she and her father drove to the hospital. The sterile smell hit her the moment they entered. Disinfectant, coffee, fear. Her mother was in a pale blue gown, sitting up in bed, her skin almost translucent under the fluorescent light. Hey sweetheart, Laura said softly. Don't look so worried, it's just another step. Julia took her hand. You should have told me. Laura smiled faintly. I wanted you to have one more carefree Christmas. I didn't want this to be what you remembered. But I would have helped, Julia said, her voice cracking. I could have done something. Laura brushed her thumb across Julia's knuckles. You're helping now, just by being here. Jordan stood at the foot of the bed, his face unreadable, but his eyes shone with quiet fear. A nurse entered, cheerful and efficient. We're almost ready, Mrs. Miller. Julia's chest tightened. Can we go with her? Just until the prep room, the nurse said. Laura squeezed Julia's hand. Take care of your brother. And don't forget to put the star on the tree this year. I will, Julia whispered. She watched as they wheeled her mother away, the sound of the gurney fading down the hall. Hours passed in the waiting room. Julia stared at the same magazine page for nearly an hour, words blurring together. Her father stepped out to make a call, leaving her alone among strangers. Across from her sat a woman with a small child asleep in her lap. They looked exhausted but peaceful, a kind of peace that comes from accepting things you can't control. Julia envied them. When the doctor finally appeared, Jordan stood quickly. Julia couldn't breathe. The surgery went well, the doctor said. We removed the affected tissue. She'll need rest, but it's a good sign. Relief flooded Julia's chest so fast it almost hurt. Her father nodded, thanking the doctor. Julia just stood there, frozen, tears blurring everything. That night, she sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching her sleep. Machines beeped softly, and moonlight filtered through the blinds. Julia leaned closer, whispering, I'm sorry, Mom, for not seeing it. For caring about stupid things. Her mother stirred, eyes fluttering open. Julia, I'm here, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Laura smiled faintly. That's my girl. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, endless, and pure. And in that silence, Julia realized Christmas would never feel the same again. The house felt different when Laura came home from the hospital. There were flowers everywhere, get well cards stacked on the counter. The scent of cinnamon and medicine mixed together, but the silence was heavier than before. Julia tried to fill it with cheer, yet her laughter sounded forced, hollow. For the first few days, Jordan worked from home, watching over Laura like a quiet sentinel. David tiptoed around, drawing pictures for their mother, and leaving them on her nightstand. But Julia didn't know what to do with herself. Every time she saw Laura resting, too weak to even knit, guilt knotted in her chest. One evening, Jordan called her into the kitchen. His voice was steady but gentle. Julia, sit down for a minute. She frowned. Am I in trouble? Not exactly. He folded his arms, leaning against the counter. I've been thinking. Your mother's recovery will take time, and she needs our help. That means everyone pitches in me, you, and David. I know, she said. I've been helping. He gave her a patient look. Helping means more than taking out the trash once. You've been living in your own world, Julia. That has to change. She crossed her arms, defensive. I can handle responsibility. You don't have to lecture me. Good, he said calmly. Because starting tomorrow, you'll be volunteering after school. Her eyes widened. Volunteering? Where? At the Willow Creek Family Shelter. Grace Turner runs it. She could use an extra pair of hands. A shelter. Julia's tone sharpened. Dad, I'm not qualified for that. I have school, and the Christmas party. Julia. His voice softened, but stayed firm. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity. You've got a good heart. I just want you to use it for something real. She looked away, jaw tight. And what if I don't want to? Then you'll do it for your mother, he said simply. Because she needs you to step up. The argument ended there. Julia went to her room, fuming, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back at her didn't seem like the same person from a few weeks ago. Her mother's illness had stripped away the glitter, the perfect makeup, the false laughter. What was left felt raw and unfamiliar. The next afternoon, she found herself standing outside the old brick building on Maple Street. A faded sign read Willow Creek Family Shelter. The air smelled of soup and detergent. Inside, the hum of voices blended with the clatter of dishes and the squeak of children's shoes against the floor. Julia hesitated at the door until a woman in her 50s appeared, wearing an apron and a warm smile. You must be Julia Miller, she said. I'm Grace Turner. Come in, dear. Julia stepped inside, clutching her bag like a shield. Hi. My dad said I should help. Grace nodded. That's right. We can always use help. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. The shelter was busy. A group of kids sat at a table, coloring with broken crayons. Two mothers folded donated clothes in the corner. Volunteers moved like clockwork, serving meals, sorting boxes, comforting crying toddlers. Julia felt out of place among them, like a sparkly ornament dropped into a box of real life. Grace handed her an apron. You can start by helping with dinner prep. It's simple. Julia looked down at the stained fabric. Do I have to wear this? Grace chuckled. You'll thank me when the soup splashes. In the kitchen, Julia met a few other volunteers. One of them was a tall boy with sandy hair, sleeves rolled up, stacking plates. He looked up and smiled. Hey, you must be new here. She recognized him immediately. Jason Reed. The same boy Madison had invited to the Christmas party. Yeah, she said awkwardly. My dad signed me up. Lucky us, he said, grinning. Grab a ladle. Soup line's about to start. For the next hour, Julia handed out bowls of soup, trying not to spill. It was harder than she expected. People moved quickly, thanked her softly, their faces lined with exhaustion. Some had children clinging to their coats. Others looked lost, invisible to the world outside those walls. When the rush was over, she leaned against the counter, her arms sore. Jason stood beside her, drying his hands. First time. Is it that obvious? He laughed a little. You'll get used to it. Grace says everyone does. Julia glanced at him. Do you volunteer here a lot? Yeah. My family helps decorate the parks for Christmas too. We've been coming here since I was a kid. She tried to imagine that a family choosing to spend their time helping strangers instead of planning parties. It felt foreign, but admirable. Grace walked by and patted Julia's shoulder. You did well today. We'll see you again tomorrow. Julia hesitated. Do I have to? You don't have to, Grace said with a kind smile. But you might want to. The next day, Julia returned, partly because she had no choice, partly because something about that place lingered in her mind. The smell of warm bread, the laughter of the children, the way Grace spoke to everyone with respect. It was different from the world she knew. While sorting clothes, Julia noticed a little girl sitting alone in the corner, hugging a worn-out stuffed rabbit. She had big eyes, tangled brown hair, and a quietness that didn't seem shut, seemed heavy. Julia knelt beside her. "Hi there. What's your name?" The girl just stared at her. Grace walked over softly. "That's Lily Brooks," she whispered. "She doesn't talk much. She's been here with her mother, Sarah, for a while now." Julia looked back at the girl. "Does she ever speak?" "Not yet," Grace said gently. "Sometimes silence says more than words." Later that afternoon, Julia saw Lily again while serving dinner. The little girl sat across the room, carefully picking at her food. Julia brought over an extra piece of cornbread. "Here, it's warm." Lily's eyes flicked up, uncertain. Then she nodded a tiny, almost invisible motion. Julia smiled. "You're welcome." For the first time that day, something in her chest softened. That night, at home, Julia's father asked how it went. She shrugged. "It was fine, I guess." Jordan smiled faintly. "Just fine. I met this woman, Grace, and a little girl named Lily. Grace Turner's one of the best people you'll ever meet," he said. "And Lily, she's had a rough life." Julia paused. "Dad, do you think Mom will get better?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I believe she will. But no matter what happens, we're going to face it together." Julia nodded, her throat tightening. When she went to bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about Lily, the way the girl's eyes had looked when she took the bread, like someone who wasn't used to kindness. And for the first time, Julia wondered if maybe she hadn't understood what Christmas was really about. The following week, Julia kept returning to the shelter. What started as an obligation became something she looked forward to. She learned how to scrub pans until they shone, how to fold baby clothes into neat stacks, how to listen to stories of people who had lost everything and still smiled. One afternoon, as she helped Grace unload donations, Jason walked by carrying boxes of canned food. "You're still here," he said with a grin. "Guess it's growing on you." Julia laughed softly. "Maybe a little." He handed her a box. Their hands brushed, briefly warm, accidental, real. Grace, watching from across the room, smiled knowingly. "The Christmas spirit," she said quietly, "works in mysterious ways." Julia didn't know what the next weeks would bring. But as she left the shelter that evening, snow began to fall again, soft, shimmering flakes catching the glow of streetlights. And for the first time in her life, Julia Miller walked home with her heart just a little lighter than before. The next days moved like quiet ripples on a frozen pond, slow, cold, but alive underneath. Julia began to show up at the shelter every afternoon after school. At first, she counted the minutes, glancing at her phone, wishing time would hurry. But by the end of the week, she had stopped looking at the clock. Something inside her was changing quietly, like frost melting under morning sunlight. Grace noticed it first. "You're getting faster at this," she said, watching Julia scrub a pot until it gleamed. Julia smiled faintly. "That's what happens when you have an excellent teacher." Grace laughed. "Oh, don't flatter me. You're doing fine on your own." The kitchen buzzed with the sound of boiling soup, clinking plates, and children's laughter echoing from the dining area. For the first time, Julia didn't feel out of place. The apron no longer embarrassed her. The smell of soap and tomato broth didn't bother her anymore. It smelled like life, messy and real. Jason passed by carrying a tray of clean mugs. "You missed a spot," he teased, pointing at a tiny streak on the pan she'd just finished. Julia rolled her eyes. "If you're so perfect, do it yourself." He grinned. "Maybe I will. But I like watching you try." His teasing tone made her laugh, something she hadn't done honestly in weeks. They worked side by side until Grace called them out front to help serve dinner. The line was long, but there was something deeply human about it, strangers sharing food, warmth, a few kind words. Julia's hands moved automatically now, filling bowls, offering smiles that were no longer forced. Lily was there too, sitting beside her mother, Sarah. The little girl clutched the same worn rabbit as always, her big eyes following Julia. When Julia caught her gaze, she smiled and waved. This time, Lily smiled back, a small, uncertain curl of the lips, but enough to light something deep in Julia's chest. That evening, after the last family left, Julia stayed to help clean up. She and Jason worked in silence for a while, their hands moving through the rhythm of clattering dishes and running water. Grace told me your mom's been sick, Jason said quietly, not looking up. Julia froze for a second, then nodded. Yeah, cancer. I'm sorry, he said simply. My uncle went through that a few years ago. It's a long road. She's strong, Julia replied softly. Stronger than I ever realized. Jason placed a cup on the rack, turning toward her. You seem strong, too. Julia laughed under her breath. You don't know me very well. Maybe not, he said, his voice calm. But I know what it looks like when someone's trying to be. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of running water filled the gap, steady and soft. When they finished, Grace came in, drying her hands on a towel. You two can go home. I'll lock up. Julia hesitated. Do you need help with anything else? Grace smiled. Not tonight. But I'm proud of you, Julia. You're starting to see things most people your age overlook. Julia tilted her head. Like what? Grace met her eyes. The beauty in ordinary kindness. At home that night, Laura was sitting up in bed, her head wrapped in a soft scarf, a book open on her lap. The sight still startled Julia, the fragile figure that used to be unshakable, yet her mother's smile was as luminous as ever. How was your day, sweetheart? Julia sat on the edge of the bed. Good. I helped serve dinner again. And there's this little girl, Lily. She never talks, but she's starting to smile now. Laura's eyes softened. She sounds lovely. She is. And her mom, Sarah. She's trying so hard. You can see it. It just makes me realize how lucky we are, even with everything going on. Laura reached out, touching her daughter's hand. That's what life teaches us when we least expect it. Gratitude isn't about what we have, it's about what we still hold, even when everything else falls apart. Julia swallowed, blinking back tears. You always know what to say. Her mother smiled faintly. It's easy when it's the truth. Over the next week, Julia found herself looking forward to the shelter more than she'd ever looked forward to anything. She'd walk in and feel the warmth hit her face, the chatter, the smell of baking bread, the laughter of children who had so little yet still found joy. She began spending more time with Lily, sitting beside her during story hour or helping her draw. One afternoon, Julia drew a picture of a Christmas tree covered in stars and handed the crayon to Lily. Do you want to add something? Lily hesitated, then drew a small red heart at the top of the tree. She didn't say a word, but Julia felt tears sting her eyes. That's perfect, she whispered. Jason passed by, catching sight of the drawing. Not bad. You're turning into an artist. Maybe I just had a good teacher, Julia said, nodding toward Lily. Lily looked up and smiled again, brighter this time. The following Friday, Julia arrived early to help decorate the dining area for Christmas Eve dinner. Grace handed her a box of tinsel and ornaments. The kids will love this. Just don't let Jason climb on the tables again. I heard that, Jason called from across the room, balancing a string of lights. Julia laughed. So did the tables. Apparently, as they worked, soft Christmas music played from an old radio. The shelter looked different. That night magical. Almost. The twinkle of the lights reflected on the windows, the air filled with warmth and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the kitchen. When they finished, Grace stood back, hands on her hips. Look at that, she said softly. If that's not Christmas spirit, I don't know what is. Julia smiled, but something deeper stirred inside her, an ache she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the thought of her mother at home. Or maybe it was the way Lily's quiet presence had changed her more than she could admit. She walked over to the window, watching the snow fall outside. Jason joined her, his voice low. You know, I think you found your place here. Julia glanced at him. Maybe I have. You've got that look, he teased. Like someone who's finally starting to see the world for what it is. And what is it? She asked softly. Messy, he said. but beautiful. She smiled. Yeah, it really is. That night, as Julia walked home, the world around her glowed with quiet peace. Houses shimmered with lights, laughter echoed from distant porches, and the cold air smelled like pine and baked cookies. For the first time in years, Julia didn't care about the party, or popularity, or perfection. She cared about the people whose names she'd barely known a month ago. About Lily's smile. About her mother's laugh. About the small, unseen acts of love that built a life worth living. And though she didn't know it yet, her journey had only just begun. By mid-December, the world outside seemed frozen in time. The nights were longer, the snow deeper, but something inside Julia had thawed. The girl who once cared about likes and designer shoes now woke up thinking about soup pots and cardboard donation boxes. Still, not everyone noticed her change. At school, Madison Blake certainly didn't. So, Madison said one morning, flipping her hair with dramatic flair, "You've basically vanished. Are you ghosting me, or just too busy saving the world?" Julia exhaled slowly. "Madison, I've just been helping out at the shelter. My mom's still recovering," and Madison interrupted with a smirk. "Right, the whole volunteer thing. That's sweet. But don't forget about the party. Everyone's talking about it. Jason Reed's supposed to come, and this could be our year." Julia paused. "Our year for what?" "For being unforgettable," Madison said, as if it were obvious. "Come on, Jules. The party's tradition." Tradition. The word echoed bitterly. A month ago, it would have meant everything. Now, it just felt small. "I don't know if I'll make it," Julia murmured. Madison frowned. "You're kidding. This is our Christmas party." "Yeah, but there are people counting on me," Julia said, glancing toward the window where snowflakes tapped against the glass. "At the shelter." Madison scoffed. "Julia, they'll survive without you. You're not saving the planet. You're just washing dishes." Julia didn't reply. For the first time, Madison's words didn't sting. They just sounded empty. That afternoon at the shelter, Julia found peace again in the noise and warmth. The children were building paper snowflakes, Grace was directing volunteers, and Jason was hanging lights near the entrance, humming along to a Christmas song. He smiled when he saw her. "Hey, Dish Queen. Back for another shift," she laughed. "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "Oh, it is," he said, grinning. "You've become an expert." Julia helped him string the lights. They worked in comfortable silence, the air scented with cinnamon and soap. After a while, Jason broke the quiet. "I saw Madison's posts about the big Christmas party. You going?" Julia shrugged. "I don't think so." He nodded. "Didn't seem like your thing anymore." She smiled, faintly. "A few weeks ago, it was the only thing I cared about. I used to think Christmas was about being noticed, having the perfect outfit, the perfect photo. But now," she looked around the room. A toddler laughed as Grace tied a Santa hat on him. Two mothers shared stories over cups of cocoa. Lily sat in a corner drawing with a new set of crayons. Julia smiled softly. "Now it feels like I'm finally seeing what matters." Jason followed her gaze. "That's the thing about helping people," he said. "It helps you too." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, something warm, fragile, and real. That evening, Julia sat beside Lily as the little girl carefully glued cotton onto a paper snowman. "You're good at that," Julia said gently. "He looks like he's having fun." Lily looked up, her big brown eyes shining. She didn't speak, but she handed Julia a tiny piece of cotton, smiling shyly. "Thank you," Julia whispered, touched by the gesture. Sarah, Lily's mother, approached quietly, her face tired but kind. "She's taken a liking to you." "That doesn't happen often." Julia smiled. "She's special." "She is," Sarah said, glancing at her daughter. "We've been through a lot. I made mistakes, bad ones. But this place and people like Grace, they gave us another chance." Her voice trembled slightly. And you've given Lily a reason to smile again. Julia blinked, emotion catching her by surprise. I haven't done anything. Yes, you have, Sarah said softly. You showed her kindness. That's something she'll remember long after the presents are gone. Julia looked at Lily again, and for a moment, she saw her younger self lonely in her own way, searching for meaning behind all the noise. Later that night, Grace gathered everyone in the dining hall. All right, team. Christmas Eve dinner is next week, and we'll need every hand we can get. Decorations, food, gifts, you name it. Jason raised a hand. Count us in. Julia smiled. I'll bring extra cookies. Cookies, Grace said with a wink. Now that's the kind of volunteer spirit I like. Laughter rippled through the room. Julia felt something she hadn't in a long time: belonging. That weekend, at home, Julia helped her mother decorate their living room. The soft lights reflected in Laura's eyes, brighter than they'd been in weeks. You look stronger, Julia said, handing her an ornament. Laura smiled. I feel stronger. Maybe it's the Christmas spirit, or maybe it's seeing you grow up right before my eyes. Julia blushed. I guess I see things differently now. Her mother hung the ornament carefully on a branch. That's the best gift you could give me. They finished decorating together in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. David ran around with tinsel tangled in his hair, laughing, and for the first time in a long while, the Miller home felt alive again. A few days later, Julia walked into the shelter carrying a bag of small wrapped gift coloring books, gloves, and candies she'd bought with her allowance. Grace's face lit up. You didn't have to do this, dear. I wanted to, Julia said. Everyone deserves a little magic. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. You're turning into quite the Christmas miracle yourself. Julia laughed softly. Don't tell Madison. She'll think I joined a cult. Jason appeared behind them, wiping his hands on a towel. A good one, I hope. They all laughed. The warmth of the moment wrapped around them like a blanket. That night, as she left the shelter, the world outside glowed with white snow under golden streetlights. She walked slowly, her breath misting in the cold air, her heart full. For the first time in her life, Julia didn't need applause, approval, or attention. She didn't need the perfect Christmas. She had found something far better: purpose, and though she didn't know it yet, that sense of purpose would soon be tested in ways that would change her forever. The snow had turned the town into a watercolor of white and silver by the time Christmas week arrived. Every house shimmered under strings of light, and yet, for Julia, the brightest glow came from the shelter on Maple Street. She spent almost every afternoon there now, helping Grace with the preparations for the Christmas Eve dinner. The dining hall looked more beautiful than ever, garlands draped along the walls, paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling, a small tree in the corner covered with ornaments the children had made. Lily had drawn a red heart for the top of the tree. Grace had placed it there herself, saying, "It's the most important ornament of all." Julia smiled at the memory as she tied ribbons around boxes of donated toys. Jason was nearby, fixing a broken string of lights that refused to cooperate. "You're doing that wrong," Julia teased. He looked up, a spark of amusement in his eyes. "You think you can do better? I know I can." She walked over and took the plug from him, twisting the wire gently until the bulbs flickered to life. Jason raised an eyebrow. "Well, look at that. The miracle worker." Julia smiled, but there was a warmth beneath it, a quiet comfort she couldn't quite name. That evening, when she arrived home, Laura was sitting by the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the snow fall. Her face looked calm, her eyes soft. "You're late," she said, her tone light. Julia set down her bag. "Sorry." Grace needed help finishing the decorations for tomorrow's dinner. Laura turned to her with a small, knowing smile. "You've grown up so much, Jules. I can see it in your eyes." Julia sat beside her. "I just wish I could do more for you, for everyone." "You already are," her mother said gently. You've found the kind of joy that lasts, the kind that doesn't come from what you get, but from what you give. Julia's throat tightened. She took her mother's hand, feeling how fragile it was in her own. I love you, Mom. I love you too, my girl, Laura whispered. Now go get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. The next day dawned cold and bright. Julia woke early, filled with a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years. The shelter buzzed with life volunteers rushing about, the smell of baked bread and roasted chicken filling the air. Children ran through the hall, their laughter mingling with the sound of soft carols playing from a dusty speaker. Grace was everywhere at once, directing traffic with her endless patience. Plates there, drinks on the left, and Jason no more, climbing on chairs. Please. Jason grinned. No promises. Julia laughed, slipping an apron over her sweater. Where do you need me? Grace pointed toward the tables. You and Lily can help set the silverware. Julia turned in. There she was. Lily in a tiny white dress with a red ribbon, holding her worn stuffed rabbit. Her brown hair was neatly combed for once, her eyes glowing with excitement. Hey, partner, Julia said softly, ready to make this place sparkle. Lily nodded, her smile shy but bright. Together, they went from table to table, arranging forks and napkins, adding little touches of candy cane here, a sprig of pine there. When they finished, Julia knelt down to Lily's height. It looks beautiful. You did an amazing job. Lily hesitated, then reached out and hugged her. It was brief, but it melted Julia's heart like sunlight on snow. By evening, the shelter was full. Families gathered at the tables, laughter and chatter filling the space. Grace stood near the front, her voice warm and strong. Tonight, she said, we celebrate more than Christmas. We celebrate hope, second chances, and the kindness that keeps us all going. Julia looked around the room, Matt, Sarah, and Lily sharing a meal, and Jason helping serve food. At the faces illuminated by soft candlelight, felt her chest tighten with gratitude. When Jason passed by her table, he leaned in. You know, you're kind of amazing when you smile like that. Julia blushed, rolling her eyes. Don't make this weird, Reed. He grinned. Too late. They both laughed, and for a moment, the world outside the cold, the fear, the uncertainty, disappeared. Later that night, after everyone had eaten, Grace gathered the children near the small Christmas tree. She handed out a few small gifts, nothing fancy, just toys, mittens, and sweets. The room sparkled with joy as the kids tore open the wrapping paper, their laughter echoing off the walls. Then it was Lily's turn. Grace handed her a little box wrapped in red paper and tied with a silver ribbon. Lily looked at Julia before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a pair of shoelaces, bright, colorful, woven with tiny threads of gold. For a moment, the room went quiet. Lily looked down at the gift, then up at Julia, her lips parted, her voice soft and uncertain. Thank you. It was the first word Julia had ever heard her speak. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Sarah gasped, tears shining in her eyes. Julia knelt down, overwhelmed, smiling through tears. You talked, Lily. You really talked. The little girl nodded, still clutching the laces. They're beautiful. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, sobbing softly. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear your voice again. The entire room seemed to glow brighter. The air felt lighter, sacred. Julia felt it, too, a warmth blooming deep inside, like the first light of dawn after a long, cold night. Later, after the tables were cleared and the guests had gone, Julia lingered by the Christmas tree. The lights twinkled softly, casting reflections across the floor. Jason joined her, hands in his pockets. That was something, he said quietly. Julia nodded. Yeah. She said her first words in months. She said them to you. Julia looked at the tree, her voice trembling. I don't know why. Maybe she saw something in me I didn't even see in myself. Jason smiled. Maybe she just knew your heart was safe. They stood there in silence, watching the lights shimmer. For the first time in her life, Julia didn't want anything more. Not gifts, not perfection, not recognition, just this moment, this peace, this love. The first lights of her heart had finally turned on. Christmas morning dawned soft and pale, the kind of morning where the whole world seems to hold its breath. Snow blanketed the streets of Willow Creek, muffling every sound, turning rooftops into ivory hills. Inside the Miller house, the scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air. Julia woke early, wrapped in a stillness she hadn't felt in years. Downstairs, the Christmas tree sparkled beside the fireplace. There were gifts, yes, but fewer than other years. Somehow, they felt more meaningful now. Her father was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes. "Morning, sweetheart," he said with a tired smile. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas." He nodded, toward the living room. "Your mom's still resting, but she wanted you to open something first." Julia frowned. "Without her," she insisted, "said it's important for your heart, whatever that means." Julia smiled softly and walked to the tree. A small, neatly wrapped box waited for her under a branch, glittering with silver tinsel. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded note and a tiny gold cross necklace. The handwriting on the note was unmistakable. "My Julia, the world may change around you, but love never does. Let this remind you that kindness is what keeps us alive. Love, Mom." Julia pressed the note to her chest. Her throat tightened. She wasn't the same girl who'd rolled her eyes at homemade sweaters or ignored her mother's quiet wisdom. She'd grown roots in places she never knew existed, deep, human, and strong. When Laura finally came downstairs, frail but smiling, Julia wrapped her arms around her and held on tightly. "Thank you, Mom." "For what?" Laura asked softly. "For showing me what matters." That afternoon, Julia returned to the shelter to help with lunch. The building was quieter than usual, filled with the smell of turkey and laughter. Families who had nowhere else to go shared tables covered in bright red cloths and paper snowflakes. Grace stood near the front, handing out plates with her usual serene smile. When she saw Julia, her face lit up. "You came back. I was wondering if we'd get to see you today." "I couldn't stay away," Julia said, hanging her coat by the door. Grace's eyes softened. "You've become a part of this place, Julia, and you've brought light with you." Julia smiled, but her gaze wandered across the room until it landed on Lily and Sarah. They were sitting at a table near the window. Lily was playing with the colorful shoelaces she'd received on Christmas Eve, weaving them between her fingers like magic threads. Julia walked over. "Hey, you two. Merry Christmas." Lily's face lit up. "Merry Christmas, Julia." Hearing the little girl's voice still filled her with awe. "They look good on you," Julia said, nodding toward the laces. Lily grinned. "They make my shoes happy." Sarah laughed quietly, her eyes shining. "You've given her something no doctor or therapist could hope." Julia shook her head. "I didn't give her anything she didn't already have. She just needed someone to listen." After lunch, Julia stayed to help clean up. The snow outside fell heavier, tapping against the windows in steady rhythm. Jason appeared beside her, balancing a tray of cups. "So, tell me," he said, "what did Santa bring you?" Julia smirked. "A necklace and a life lesson." "Wow," he said, pretending to be impressed. "Santa's really stepped up his game this year." She laughed. "What about you?" He shrugged. "A new toolbox. Not exactly poetic, but useful." "You'd make it poetic if you tried," Julia teased. He leaned against the counter, his tone turning softer. "You know, I've seen a lot of people come and go through this place. Some help for a day, maybe two. But you changed things." Julia blinked. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Jason said quietly. "You did what most people don't. You cared." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, yet peaceful. Then, Grace's voice broke the silence. "Jason, Stop flirting and help me with these tables. Jason chuckled. You heard the boss. Julia grinned. Go on. Wouldn't want to get fired on Christmas. By the time Julia walked home, the sky was glowing with the colors of dusk lavender and gold blending over the snow. The world felt still, wrapped in its own quiet magic. When she opened the door, the smell of roasted turkey filled the air. Her father was setting the table. Her mother was sitting nearby, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. David ran up to her, waving a small Christmas card he'd made. Look, Julia, I drew you as a superhero. She laughed, kneeling to hug him. I love it, buddy. Jordan smiled from across the table. We were waiting for you to start dinner. Julia felt her throat tighten again. She looked around the table, the simple meal, the candles, the warmth, and realized she didn't need anything else. But just as she sat down, a thought sparked in her mind. Mom, she said softly, would it be okay if we had guests? Laura raised an eyebrow. Guests? From the shelter, Julia said quickly. Lily and her mom. They don't have much, and I thought maybe. Her mother smiled before she could finish. Of course, honey. That would make this Christmas complete. Within an hour, Julia and her father were back at the shelter, inviting Sarah and Lily to join them. Sarah hesitated at first, but Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. Go, she said. You've earned it. When they arrived at the Miller house, Lily gasped softly at the tree, the lights, the smell of food. It's beautiful, she whispered. Julia knelt beside her. I'm glad you're here. Dinner that night felt different from any other Christmas dinner Julia had ever known. It wasn't fancy or loud. It was filled with something pure, connection. They prayed together before eating, and even little David bowed his head solemnly. Afterward, as laughter filled the room, Lily tugged gently at Julia's sleeve. Can I tell you something? Julia smiled. Of course. Lily leaned closer, whispering, when I was scared, I used to think about angels. But now, I think about you. Julia froze, her heart swelling so quickly it hurt. Oh, Lily, I'm no angel. Lily shook her head. You're better. You're real. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Julia stood by the tree, staring at the tiny red heart at the top. It shimmered under the soft glow of the lights. Her father walked up beside her, holding a cup of coffee. She's special, that little girl, he said. Yeah, Julia whispered. She reminded me what it means to believe again. Jordan nodded slowly. You've changed, Julia. I hope you know how proud your mom and I are. She smiled faintly. I just started paying attention. Dad, the world's full of miracles. We just don't always notice them. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall through the window. And as Julia looked at the tree, at the simple gifts beneath it, she realized something she would never forget. Sometimes, the smallest gift, a smile, a touch, a pair of shoelaces can change everything. January arrived quietly, as if even the wind didn't want to disturb the peace that Christmas had left behind. The holidays were over, the lights were coming down, but in the Miller house, a different kind of light remained, one that came from within. Laura's color was slowly returning. Her laughter, faint at first, had begun to fill the house again. There were still doctor visits and medicine, but there was also hope, tangible. Like the warmth of a blanket pulled close on a cold morning, Julia noticed every detail. She'd learned to read her mother's silences, to recognize when she needed a hand to hold instead of words. She'd learned patience, gratitude, and the quiet strength that came from loving someone through fear. One afternoon, as she helped her mother organize family photos, Laura looked up with a playful smile. You've become my little nurse. Julia laughed softly. I think I missed my calling. You found it, Laura said. It just doesn't have a uniform. They both laughed, but Laura's eyes lingered on her daughter. You know, Jules, I used to worry about you. You had such a big heart, but you hid it behind what you thought people wanted you to be. I see you now, and I see who you were always meant to become. Julia felt her throat tighten. I didn't realize how blind I was until everything changed. That's life's strange mercy, Laura whispered. It opens our eyes, sometimes through tears. At the shelter, life moved on too. The Christmas decorations were packed away, but laughter still echoed through the halls. Grace, ever patient, guided new volunteers, while Jason repaired a leaky faucet near the back door. When Julia walked in, Grace looked up with delight. Ah, my favorite helper. I was just about to send Jason after you. Jason glanced over, pretending to be offended. You say that to everyone, not to you, Grace teased. Now go help her with the donation boxes before you start flirting again. Julia rolled her eyes. She's never going to let that go, is she? Jason smirked. Probably not. But I can live with it. Together they carried boxers filled with winter clothes into the storage room. Dust floated through the sunlight, streaming from the window, and for a while, neither spoke. There was comfort in the silence, the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill the gaps. When they finished, Julia brushed her hands off. So, did you make any resolutions this year? Jason smiled faintly. Just one. Oh yeah, what's that? To keep doing what makes me feel alive. Julia raised an eyebrow. And what's that? He looked at her, his voice quiet. This? Helping people. Being around you. Her cheeks flushed. That's the good one. I thought so, he said, smiling. As weeks passed, Julia continued to help at the shelter whenever she could. Lily and Sarah had become like family. On weekends, Julia would bring little crafts for Lily, who now talked more and more, her words soft but sure. One Saturday, Sarah approached Julia after lunch, holding a small envelope. I wanted you to have this. Julia frowned. What is it? Sarah smiled. A thank you note. From both of us. Julia opened the envelope. Inside was a simple card, decorated with hand-drawn hearts and crooked letters that read, "Thank you for helping me find my voice." Julia's eyes filled instantly. Sarah, I don't know what to say. You don't have to, Sarah replied gently. You already said it with everything you've done. They hugged, and for a moment, Julia felt something beyond happiness peace. That evening, when Julia came home, she found her father sitting in the living room with a quiet smile on his face. The doctor called, he said softly. Your mother's scans looked clear. The treatment worked. Julia froze. Are you serious? Jordan nodded, his eyes glistening. She's officially cancer-free. Julia didn't even realize she'd started crying until she felt her father's arms around her. She did it, she whispered. She really did it. Jordan smiled. You both did. You gave her strength when she needed it most. They stood there in the middle of the living room, holding on to each other as snow began to fall outside once more soft, slow, and full of grace. The next day, Julia ran straight to the shelter with the news. Grace was the first person she told. The woman's face broke into a radiant smile. That's the best thing I've heard all year, she said, hugging Julia tightly. Jason appeared from the hallway, drying his hands on a towel. Good news travels fast around here, he said, smiling. Julia laughed through tears. She's healthy, Jason. My mom's okay. He didn't hesitate, he just pulled her into a hug. Told you love heals, things science can't. She stayed there for a moment, her cheek against his shoulder, feeling a kind of warmth that went deeper than comfort. A few days later, the shelter held a small gathering to celebrate the new year. It wasn't fancy, just cocoa, music, and laughter. Julia looked around at the faces she'd come to love. Grace's calm smile, Jason's kind eyes, Sarah and Lily's bright laughter. When Grace stood up to make a toast, she raised her mug of cocoa high. To new beginnings, she said. To hope that never quits. And to the people who remind us that kindness is the purest form of love. Julia lifted her mug to love that heals. Everyone echoed the words, to love that heals. And in that simple phrase, Julia found the meaning she'd been searching for since the beginning of it all. That night, as she walked home under the glowing streetlights, her breath clouded the cold air. She looked up at the sky deep indigo, sprinkled with stars, and smiled. Her heart was full, her soul quiet. The world wasn't perfect, and it didn't have to be. Because real love didn't need perfection to heal. It just needed to be shared. And for the first time in her life, Julia Miller felt whole. The seasons began to turn again. Winter softened into the pale promise of spring, and the snow that once blanketed Willow Creek melted into glittering puddles along the sidewalks. But even as the world changed, the lessons of that winter stayed with Julia Miller, like gentle fingerprints on her soul. It had been 3 months since her mother's recovery, and life was slowly finding its rhythm again. The hospital visits had stopped, the medicine bottles were tucked away, and laughter had returned to the Miller home in full color. Julia stood by the window one morning, watching her mother water the small plants by the kitchen sill. Sunlight glowed against Laura's face, warm and golden, and for a moment Julia just smiled in silence, remembering all they had endured. "Everything's coming back to life," Laura said, turning to her. "Even us." Julia nodded. "I think this is the first time I've really felt alive." Her mother tilted her head with a soft smile. "And what are you going to do with that feeling?" Julia looked out the window again. The world beyond shimmered with new light. "Keep it alive," she said. "For everyone who needs it." That afternoon, Julia returned to the shelter, carrying a small cardboard box tied with a red ribbon. Grace greeted her at the door with her usual warmth. "Well, if it isn't our shining star," she said. "You've been scarce lately, young lady." Julia laughed. "School's been crazy, but I could never stay away too long." Grace eyed the box curiously. "What's that?" "A surprise," Julia said, setting it gently on the front table. "But I'll need everyone here to see it." Within a few minutes, Jason, Sarah, and Lily joined them near the tree that still stood in the corner of the hall. Stripped of most of its ornaments, but somehow more beautiful for its simplicity. The children who had come for lunch gathered around too, whispering with curiosity. Julia untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of colorful shoelaces, red, gold, silver, blue, and green, each carefully looped into a perfect bow. Grace's eyes softened. "Oh, Julia. Last Christmas," Julia said, her voice gentle, "Lily reminded me that the smallest gifts can hold the biggest meanings, so I thought we could start a new tradition. Every year, we'll hang a pair of shoelaces on the tree, a symbol of kindness, of walking with others when they can't walk alone." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Grace reached out, touching one of the laces. "That's beautiful, dear. Truly beautiful." Jason smiled, shaking his head. "You just can't stop changing lives, can you?" Julia blushed. "I'm just trying to keep the light going." "Then let's hang the first one together," Grace said softly. Julia handed a pair of golden laces to Lily. The little girl took them carefully, her small fingers tracing the loops. Then, with Julia's help, she tied them to a low branch of the tree. Everyone clapped quietly, but Lily turned to Julia and whispered, "Can we do one more?" "Of course." Lily chose another pair. This time Man held them out to her mother. Sarah's eyes glistened as she tied them beside the first. "For new beginnings," she said. Jason added a silver pair, grinning. "For good friends." Grace hung one of deep green, "For hope that doesn't fade." And finally, Julia tied one herself, soft white laces that shimmered under the lights. She whispered, "For love that heals." Afterward, they all stood in silence, watching the tree gleam softly with its colorful ribbons. There was no music, no crowd, no noise, just the quiet hum of hearts connected by something unseen yet unbreakable. Grace spoke first. "I think this is the most beautiful Christmas tree we've ever had." Julia smiled. "It's not Christmas, but maybe the spirit doesn't need a calendar." "You're right," Grace said. "Love doesn't keep time." As the months passed, the shoelace tree became a tradition at the shelter. Visitors and families would add their own laces, some plain, some bright, some tied in memory of those they'd lost. And every time Julia saw it, she felt that same flicker of warmth that had begun with one quiet Christmas miracle. Her life moved forward, but she carried those memories like anchors Grace's steady wisdom. Jason's laughter, Lily's first whispered "thank you," her mother's resilience. They had all become part of the story she'd tell herself whenever the world seemed dark. One afternoon, as she and Jason walked home together, he glanced at her with a smile. "You ever think about how far you've come?" Julia chuckled. "Every day, it feels like I'm not the same person anymore." "That's the thing," he said, kicking lightly at the snow. "You didn't change, you just became who you were supposed to be." Julia thought about that. The wind carried the scent of pine and melting snow, and she smiled. "I guess you're right." They walked in silence for a while before she added, "Jason, can I tell you something?" "Anything." "When my mom was sick, I thought my world was falling apart. But it wasn't. It was being rebuilt. I just couldn't see it yet." Jason's gaze softened. "Sometimes life has to break us open before light can get in." Julia nodded slowly. "Yeah, and sometimes it takes a little girl with colorful shoelaces to show us how to walk again." He smiled. "You're going to make Grace cry if you say that to her." "Then I'll say it twice," Julia said, laughing. That evening, Julia sat by her window as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold. Her mother was humming softly downstairs, her father reading by the fire, and the warmth of home wrapped around her like a prayer. She looked down at the necklace her mother had given her, the small gold cross catching the last glimmer of sunset. It shone like a promise. She whispered to herself, "Love doesn't end, just finds new ways to stay outside." The first snowflakes of late winter began to fall again, dancing gently through the air. And as she watched them, Julia knew that the ties she had made of kindness, of love, of faith would last far beyond any single season. Because in the end, the truest gifts aren't the ones we open. They're the ones that open us. And so, Julia Miller's story reminds us that sometimes, life has to slow us down so we can see what really matters. Love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. It often hides in the simplest things: a shared meal, a quiet word, a pair of colorful shoelaces. It's those small, ordinary acts of kindness that stitch our hearts together, turning strangers into family, and pain into purpose. If this story touched you, take a moment to breathe it in. Remember the people who've helped you walk when you couldn't find your way, and maybe, just maybe, be that person for someone else. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next story. Tell us in the comments, what's one small act of kindness that changed your life? We'd love to read your thoughts. And when you're ready for another story that will warm your heart and stir your soul, stay here with us. There's always another tale waiting to remind you what love can do. Here at Lasting Tales, every story leaves a mark that time can't erase. We'll see you in the next one.